Hi, I'm Caitlin. I work at the Yarn Barn of Kansas, and today we're going to talk about different spinning fibers, where they come from, how they're harvested, and what types of yarn you can produce with them. So to start out, let's talk about wool, since that's the main fiber that you'll find in the shop. It's also what we recommend for beginning spinners because it tends to be the easiest fiber to start with. I have a variety of wools in front of me. Sheep's wool mostly is produced from white sheep. It's easier to dye that way because the white will take the color without modifying it at all, but sheep do come in a variety of grays, even as dark as a very dark brown or a black. And you can over dye those natural sheep colors as well. They give you some interesting effects. Both of these were dyed on white wools. You can see you can get a pretty good depth of color on a white wool, but if you dye over a darker wool or a blend of a white and a dark wool, you can get more complex color depth than you can if you dye on just a plain white fleece. So sheep's wool, as the name implies, comes off of sheep. It is their hair. Wool is a specific type of hair. It's more curly, and the texture of the actual fibers is a little bit different, so that's why we make the distinction. Sheep's wool grows continuously throughout their lives. It starts when they're lambs, and they grow wool until the day they die. Farmers will typically shear sheep once a year. That's about the rate where you need to remove the wool to keep them from carrying too much hair. It's very heavy, and it's also very insulative, which we know about as crafters, but it applies when it's on the animal as well. And if you leave the wool on for too long, they start experiencing stress from the amount of body heat that gets contained by the wool on their bodies. So every year sheep get shorn. Typically, they don't get cut during the process. They're not exactly willing participants because they don't like interacting with humans very much, but they don't get hurt by it. It's just a haircut. So wool is one of the more renewable resources we have because sheep will produce it whether we want them to or not, and we have to take it off them, so we might as well turn it into yarn. For spinning purposes, wool tends to be easy because it has that crimp, so the fibers themselves are wiggly or coily, and that makes them lock together better when you're spinning. Wool yarn can be kind of a matte surface. Moda is a woolen spun yarn, so it's very soft surfaced. It's not going to stand up to abrasion very well, but it's full of air pockets, which makes it warmer. On the other side of the scale, something like Malabrigo worsted is what's called a worsted spun yarn. The fibers are all lined up, and so it makes it kind of silkier and shinier. Different breeds make shinier or more matte yarns when you're done spinning them, and the way you spin them can also modify how they look. So moving on from wool, let's talk about cotton, which is the other major fiber that you'll find in the shop and out in the broader fiber world. Cotton is a plant-derived fiber. It comes from the cotton plant, surprise, surprise. Again, generally, commercially grown cotton is white because it's easier to dye. The cotton that has been bred for commercial processing also has fibers that are exactly the right length to be processed in industrial equipment. The pressure of what the equipment can tolerate has actually changed the types of cotton that we grow over time. So commercial cottons have slightly shorter fibers than historical colored cottons. This is a green cotton, and I know it doesn't look super green, but compared to the white, it does have some color to it. This green is integral to the cotton fibers. They actually grow that color. Colored cottons also come in a couple shades of brown and tan. There's a kind of a golden one, and there's several shades of green. And these generally are older strains of cotton that were grown when most of the processing was still occurring by hand. So the fibers tend to be longer because that actually makes life easier for a human hand spinner. It doesn't work as well in the industrial equipment that we mostly use to process white cottons. So for hand spinning purposes, you may find it easier to start with one of these naturally colored cottons because the fibers are a little longer. It gives you a little bit more of a chance to get the twist in that you need to stabilize the yarn. You can also find dyed cottons. These are from 316 Dye Studio. She produces, I think, a range of 12 different colors, and we carry all of them. So you can find those as well if you want to get a little bit more adventurous with your cotton spinning. Cotton's also pretty easy to dye at home if you've ever tie-dyed a t-shirt. The process is the same for yarn. When you're spinning cotton at home, you're going to want, rather than a suspended spindle or a drop spindle, you want a supported spindle that spins on a surface like a top. And that's because the fibers are very short and very fine, so you don't want any extra strain from having to hold the weight of the spindle as you form the yarn. Like wool, cotton can be made into yarn with a variety of styles and shininess. Mercerized cotton, which is an additional process where the fibers are lengthened and kind of pressed, makes for a very shiny yarn like the Ultra Pima from Cascade Yarns. Unmercerized cotton, which is what you would generally produce if you're working straight from this fiber, will make a more matte, softer look on your yarn, like the Pima 100 from Barocco. So cotton, because it grows on a plant, is harvested from fields. It is the fibers that surround the seeds of the plant. So you have to grow the plants all season, let them bloom, and let the seeds mature before you can harvest the fiber. So it has a relatively long growing season. It takes about 7 or 8 months to get from seedling all the way to harvestable cotton. And especially toward the end of that period when the fibers are forming, but they're not fully ready to harvest yet, farmers have to hope that it doesn't rain, because rain on those fibers can actually force them to mat together and then rot, and you end up losing the crop. So cotton is generally grown in warm places, ideally places that aren't too humid, but that get a lot of rain or have access to a river. That's part of why you see a lot of like Egyptian cotton and Indian cotton. Those are regions where it's hot enough for the plants to be happy and to grow well, and there's also sufficient water supply available to keep them well watered so that they will produce a lot of flowers and therefore a lot of fiber. Okay, so moving on from cotton, we'll talk about another popular cellulose fiber, which is linen. We carry it in small quantities. Linen is a relatively challenging spin because the fibers themselves are very long and relatively brittle when they're dry. Linen is another plant. It's the flax plant. And flax is processed very differently from cotton. Where cotton is the fibers around the seeds, linen is actually from the stems of the plant. So this is the fibers that run lengthwise from the roots all the way to the tips of the plant. So linen fibers can be as long as 3 to 3.5 feet if the person processing them was very careful and kept them intact for the whole length of the plant, or they can get broken down into very short fibers, which are often called tow. Those usually aren't sold to the hand spinning market. They're pretty coarse, and because they're short, you have to twist them very tightly, so you end up with something that's more like cordage or twine or rope. They're very handy for industrial applications. Historically, they were used for things like boats and harnesses. Anywhere you needed a sturdy rope, linen was frequently used. You'll also see ramie and hemp, which are similar fibers from different plants. We don't currently have a source for those fibers in spinnable form, but you will see some yarns that include those fibers, and they'll behave very similarly to a linen. So to spin linen, typically modern spinners will work on a wheel because you need both hands free, one to operate the drafting triangle and one to actually wet the fibers as you go. What that does, because these are the lengthwise fibers from the stalks of the plant, is it activates the pectin, which is the same thing that makes jams and jellies set. It's a kind of rubbery glue-like substance that grows in certain plants, and getting it wet again will help reactivate it, and it helps those fibers stick together to make a smoother, stronger thread at the end. So line spun linen is made from those long fibers. It's typically wet spun rather than dry spun, and that will produce a yarn like this that's fairly shiny. And that's because those long fibers are all lined up together, and it makes a really beautiful surface. Linen plants typically grow in cooler areas. They're a very short-lived plant. From seed to harvest is typically around 8 weeks, sometimes as long as 12, depending on the season. But you plant the seeds early in the spring, and then you hope for a lot of water. They like to have wet feet. And then the plants come up and they bloom. And shortly after they bloom, actually before the seeds are ripe, you go through the field and you actually have to hand pull the plants. There is no mechanized method of harvesting linen. So that's part of why the cost of linen yarns and fibers and fabrics tends to be higher than the cost of cotton equivalents, because there are mechanized ways to harvest cotton. There's no such thing for linen. Almost all of the processing still has to be done by hand. There are machines that can help with certain parts of the process. But because the fibers are relatively delicate and the point is to keep them long, you don't want any mechanical breakage, and humans can be a little more careful than machines can in that process. To get the fibers out of the stems of the plants, you have to pull the plants, dry them out, and then you have to get them wet again and actually let them rot. It's a controlled rotting process where you break off kind of the outer layer of the plant and you keep the fibers on the inside intact. And then you put them through what's called a flax break, where you actually physically break off all the shreds of the outside layer of the plant and get the fibers free of them. And then you do some further processing. Depending on how fine the fiber is that you want, you can run the flax through a hackle or a heckle, big pointy tool with lots of nails sticking up, and you actually throw the fibers onto it and drag them through, and it pulls off anything short or easily broken, and you're left with the really beautiful, long, strong fibers that you want for spinning. Okay, the next fiber we'll talk about is silk, which is the other main protein fiber that you see in fiber shops and in the textile world. Silk is produced by silk moths during their pupal stage. So first the caterpillars are fed on mulberry leaves, and they grow and grow and grow, and you keep feeding them more leaves until they finally reach the point where they're ready to pupate and become moths. And so they spin a silk filament and they wind it into a cocoon around themselves, and the silk is glued together with something called sericin, which is a type of gum. And that holds the cocoon in shape while the caterpillar transforms into a moth. For silk production, you have two options at the point where the cocoons have been formed. You can leave them alone, let the moths emerge, and then process the silk fibers. The result of this is that the moths will cut a hole in the cocoon to emerge from, so all of that one long fiber that formed the cocoon will turn into many much shorter fibers. And that will produce something like this silk top, where the fibers themselves are only about 3 or 4 inches long. This is much shorter than the original filament. Having them shorter does make it a little bit easier to spin because you don't have to manage these tremendously long fibers. But silk is very slippery. It's a smooth surfaced thread, and it doesn't have any crimp or any coil to it. So when you're spinning, you have to balance how much twist you need to hold the fibers together against how much twist turns it into wire rather than a nice yarn. The other option, other than letting the moths emerge, would be to boil the cocoons while the caterpillars are still in them. And what this does is it breaks down the sericin so that you can pull that filament free and you can actually unspool the entire cocoon. The caterpillars do die in the process. In a lot of places where silk is traditionally produced, the boiled caterpillars are considered a delicacy and they're then eaten, so they don't get wasted. And one of the more complicated details about silk culture is that the Bombyx mori silk moth, which is the one that produces the silk fibers that we're all familiar with, is a form of livestock. They've been bred and kept in close contact with humans for so long that they can only survive with human intervention. They're not capable of surviving in the wild, so even if the moths are permitted to emerge, what you're doing is producing a new crop of silk caterpillars to maintain and grow into more silk cocoons. They can't be released into the wild to have a full life because their full life is about 3 days long after they emerge. Their only purpose at that point, like cicadas, is to find a mate and lay eggs, and then they go and die. So you will find some versions of silk that are called piece silk. And the idea with those is that the moths are permitted to emerge. They're not boiled as caterpillars, which is a kindness to the moths. It lets them complete their life cycle. But it changes the type of silk that you get, and it also produces a lot of moths. And ultimately what that would do if we only did that type of silk production where we let the moths emerge and we let them produce more eggs is we would be overrun with silk moths. So you have to make choices about what types of silk you're pursuing and what your goals are with your spinning or your project. Spun silk like this is very shiny. Silk fibers just are. But if you look up very closely, you can see there's a little tiny halo on spun silk that you don't get on filament silk or reeled silk, which is where the cocoons are just pulled so that they unravel. And that gives you one fiber that can be nearly a mile long. Filament silk or reeled silk is much stronger than spun silk because it is a single continuous thread throughout the whole length of the skein or the cone. It tends to be thinner. It also tends to be much more expensive because the processing is more involved to very carefully unravel those threads from the cocoons and keep them all straight and tidy throughout the whole production process versus piece silk or various spun silks where the fibers are shorter and they can be run through kind of a standard spinning process to create the yarn. A lot of the silk that you can find for hand spinners is going to be either piece silk or it will have been chopped, so it was removed as a filament and then it was cut mechanically into shorter lengths to make it easier for a hand spinner to work with. Okay, the last fiber we will talk about is processed cellulose fibers or manufactured cellulose fibers. And these are natural materials that have been chemically processed to make them into a different form than they would normally have been. So this includes things like tencel and bamboo. Those are probably the most familiar ones. Rayon is another example of a processed cellulose fiber. So tencel and rayon typically are produced from wood pulp. So they're often derived from like the leftovers from paper making or lumber, lots of different industrial processes that produce leftover bits and pieces of wood. And those pieces can then be chemically processed to basically remove the cellulose and make it into a solution, so like a liquid, which is then extruded into fibers. Much like silk, those extruded fibers can be basically infinitely long, so they're typically cut into shorter lengths to make them easier to work with for the hand spinning market. Bamboo goes through a similar process where the bamboo stalks, which are rigid, more like trees or like very large grass, which is what a bamboo is, into a cellulose soup, and then that is extruded into fibers that can then be spun. So all of these yarns are going to behave like a lot of their cellulose relatives. They'll be relatively cool. They tend to be drapey and shiny, more akin to linen or mercerized cotton. The processing of them varies depending on the country they're being processed in and the source material for the cellulose. Tencel typically uses waste products. It doesn't tend to use new wood because there's other purposes that is more lucrative to put toward. So this is making use of the leftover bits of the process. Bamboo is sometimes produced from newly cut bamboo. And it grows really fast. It is a grass, so you can get bamboo that grows several feet in a season. So cutting new shoots to make bamboo fiber out of isn't ecologically damaging the way cutting entire trees down to make tencel fiber would be. But the chemicals involved in these processes are pretty strong, and some of the places where these fibers are produced don't have very stringent worker protections or ecological protections. Luckily, we're starting to see some progress in both of those areas where factories are starting to enact rules and regulations to protect their workers from the caustic chemicals that are involved in the processes, and to manage the water and the wastewater that they produce in creating these fibers to keep them from being just released into the environment. So that's nice to see. Tencel is typically not spun on its own. It's a very slippery fiber. And because it is typically chopped into shorter lengths, it can be tricky to get a continuous thread out of it as a hand spinner. So often it's used as kind of a mix-in. So this is a half and half tencel and merino blend, which will give you a drapier, more fluid yarn than you would get if it was pure wool. And it'll also give you something that has a little bit more memory and bounce to it than a purely tencel or bamboo yarn would be. We do carry some bamboo and tencel yarns in the shop. This is bamboo pop, which is half and half bamboo and cotton. So it's a little bit shinier than a cotton would typically be. It's got a lot more drape than a cotton would normally have, but it's also got a little bit more rigidity than a pure tencel or a rayon yarn would have. Another option that a lot of people go for is Marikita, which is half and half alpaca and tencel. Alpaca is a pretty drapey fiber to begin with, and adding the tencel to it gives it this almost liquid fluidity when you work with it. And it also makes it a little bit cooler. Alpaca is really insulative. A lot of people find it actually too warm to wear much of the year, so adding tencel or another processed cellulose fiber can help reduce how much body heat it keeps in and make it more comfortable to wear more often, which is nice if you want to wear your creations more of the year. So thank you for joining me on this tour of several of the fibers that you can find in the textile world and where they come from and how they're made. I hope you'll swing by the shop or drop us a line to let us know if you enjoyed this and if you'd like to see more information about different fibers and what their qualities are.